The most disturbing and depraved zombie movie ever made, according to Roomwork magazine. But is it really that bloody and gory? Let's find out. Today we're going to be talking about The Sadness, a Taiwanese movie that was made during the height of the most recent pandemic that we all lived. So, in this movie, we're going to have very, very strong references to kind of how the U.S. had handled the pandemic we were in. There's a lot of people believing, people not believing. Is this all because there's an election coming up? Pretty much everything you heard in the United States of how they handled the pandemic, which ironically, this movie was made in Taiwan and their cases were at zero for like the first 2 years. They actually handled it really well, and they didn't have all these issues, but that wouldn't make for a good story in a movie, now would it? So, this is not really a zombie movie. It does have kind of the same trope-ish stuff from a zombie movie, but kind of dialed up to another level. And it doesn't really follow any of the rules and the lore of a zombie movie. This is an infection movie. This is a virus. It's called the Alvin virus or the Allen virus. It's going around and it's making people into homicidal maniacs. We find out in the movie that this virus affects a certain part of your brain. And in this part of your brain, it kind of is what makes you feel shame, or it'll prevent you from doing stuff that you normally would not do. But because this part of the brain is affected, you can't help what you're doing. You know what you're doing. You're enjoying what you're doing because these are all the things you've ever wanted to do and you just can't stop yourself. They refer to it as trying to make it so you don't blink. You might hold it for a while, but eventually you're just going to give in and you're going to blink. And there's nothing you can do about it. And that's exactly what's happening with all the people in this movie that are infected. And that's kind of where the title The Sadness comes from, because you'll see with a lot of the infected that they'll sometimes have a tear rolling down their face, or their eyes will be really, really wet underneath. Like they know what they're doing is wrong, but they just can't help themselves. And this movie pushes every boundary that you can. Another way that it's different from most other zombie movies is these people can run, which I know. We've seen World War Z, we've seen Dawn of the Dead, where people actually run, but in this one, they run, they talk, they say some really fucked up sadistic shit just to try to torment you and have a fun time. And their goal is pretty much to inflict as much punishment and pain to you as possible, and they're loving every minute of it. And all these people act very, very cognitive. They know what they're doing. In one scene, there's a police officer who actually shoots his gun at another person because he knows what he's doing. He just wants to kill him. But let's kick things off. We meet Kat and Jim. They're the two lovebirds in the movie. This is what the movie is going to center around. Like a typical movie, these two are going to get split up and try to find their way back to each other. But first thing, they wake up and they're having a small conversation. We get a little bit. Jim isn't really working a whole lot. Kat's going to work. He's going to take her to work. She plans on taking a vacation soon, and he thinks he's going to go to a job. They have kind of a little bit of a fight over it, but not really anything. And that's pretty much the whole story of what we get with those two. He ends up driving her off and taking her to the train station. On the way there, they do pass by a nice bloody scene. And we see the cops arresting the guy, and he's very, very angry and flipping out, and like they can't control him, resisting arrest. And we see a bloody sheet on his way back through. The police car is still there, but there's no bodies or anybody even around. Weird. But he ends up going to a local breakfast place, and he's going to get a coffee. It's a regular joint he goes to, and everything is as normal as can be as he looks around. And then we see this old lady come in the background. And this was the same old lady he had seen earlier in the morning, and she was standing on a rooftop all covered in blood. But we see her kind of in the distance as a silhouette type character. She ends up walking up to where the guy working is. She grabs the basket out of a deep fryer and she pours it on his head, full of french fries too. So that was a waste of food, lady. I mean, come on. There's starving people in this world. There's a pandemic, damn it. But anyways, as the melting down on his face, she starts tearing away at his face and ripping off the flesh. She then ends up spitting in another guy's eye, and we see him then turn, and he starts stabbing his best friend in the neck with a knife. She's chasing after Jim. She follows him out into the road, and she gets creamed by a car, and the guy driving the car is laughing hysterically, blood all down his body, and then we see someone get thrown off a rooftop, and this is when all carnage ensues. There's people stabbing each other, punching. Everybody's just trying to kill each other. We even see one guy, as Jim's trying to run away, they take his arm and they bend it this direction on steps and literally stomp right there. We hear it crack and he's crying like crazy. He ends up getting back to his apartment, and at the apartment his neighbor sneaks in, and he's trying to text Kat to let her know what's going on, to try to get a hold of her. The neighbor comes in, sneaks in behind him. He turns around at the last second and he blocks the gardening shears with his hand. His hand. Not a good choice. He ends up getting 2 of his fingers cut off. And he ends up knocking the guy down and leaving, hops on his moped and takes off through the city. We see some more carnage and some mayhem, and all these people are chasing him, and he ends up going kind of off into the sunset, where we now go follow Kat, who's on this train, and she's sitting next to this guy. He's an old guy. His name's the businessman. They don't give him an actual name. That's just it. And he ends up kind of hitting on her, and she doesn't want no part of it. And then he's kind of talking under his breath about how women are pieces of shit these days. You can't even give them a compliment without it being sexual harassment. When she kind of pushed him away and told him no, and he kept going, he did not learn how to stop his advances. So, kind of being a dick here, bud. But we see this one guy get onto the train. He's wearing glasses, and you can see a tear roll down his face. And then he pulls out his knife, and he starts stabbing people in the back, left and right. He even jumps on some guy and stabs him directly right in the neck, and the blood just spews out. It looks like so comical. There's so much blood. But he kills a lot of people on this train real fast. It's real bloody, it's gory, it's graphic, and it's intense. And when they finally subdue him, everybody thinks it's safe, and then another person on the train starts stabbing and killing a bunch of people. And there's people biting people's necks off, biting at ankles. And by the time it's all said and done, when you're looking around, there's people slipping and sliding on all the blood that's on the floor of this subway cart or train cart. We do see that Kat had gave up her seat to a girl named Molly, and since Molly was sitting in her seat, this businessman, he becomes the main villain of this movie at this point, and he opens up his umbrella, stabs her directly in the eyeball. If you don't like eyeball shit, this one will get you a little bit. Not super disturbing, but it's enough where it's one of those things that people don't really like to see. So, they end up getting off of the train. When it finally stops, everybody's escaping and they're trying to get away. The businessman does chase after the 2 girls. Kat is now trying to help Molly get out of there. And another guy, they run into him, and he gets mad, asks her if she's blind, finds out, oh, fuck yeah, you got stabbed in the eye. He ends up trying to fight the businessman, but the businessman ain't gonna have that shit. Businessman bites his nose off. And he ends up breaking out and grabbing an axe from like a fire safety glass thing, which was magically down there. And he axes the guy to death. We don't get to see it though. For a movie that's so depraved and so bloody and gory, and it just has this following of how bloody and gory it is, we don't get to see the axing. And this kind of becomes a theme of the movie where I wouldn't call this movie like extremely disturbing because there is a lot of blood. There is a good amount of gore in this movie. It is violent. People are saying some sick shit. People do some sick shit in this movie. But it does show restraint. So with the restraint, you have less of a disturbing factor. Disturbing themes? Yes. There are some in here. But disturbing visuals, I felt like it could have showed more. And here is a prime example where it just shows him axing the guy, and it's from the point of view kind of like you're the guy almost, and you just see him kind of slamming his axe down. Whoosh, and it is what it is. So they end up escaping. There's a guy security guard who tries closing the gates. They do sneak out in time. They punch him in the face because they're pissed because they were trying to get away from that guy. And he was just doing what he was told and closing the door because there's a fucking pandemic going on and people are acting like nut jobs. They end up going to the hospital where they now finally get to have some safety, some salvation. So now we cut back to Jim. And Jim is riding his moped around, and he comes across a basketball court where there's 4 kids beating the shit out of a guy. They are smashing him in the head with baseball bats, and they're hitting him and kicking him. They even have barbed wire wrapped around a basketball pole, and they pick him up and ram him into it. They call it playing the nutcracker. And they do this a couple times, and Jim ends up going in there, fending off the kids to get him away, and the guy looks up at him and says, "Why did you make them stop? I was about to shoot my load." So that's where these zombies are a little different. So I call them infected. They are conscious on what they're doing, and the depravity and the anger of what they do and the side of sexual are the 2 things in the brain that can't stop themselves. So they're extremely violent and sexual people. And earlier in the movie, we hear an intercom, and the guy tells all the guys to come down to City Hall so he can chop off all their dicks. And all the women need to come down so they can get raped by dogs. And there is nonstop talk like this in the movie about how I'm going to rape you, I'm going to peel your skin off. It's just very, very sick shit that they say. But anyways, he ends up fending him off. The guy's mad. He ends up cutting the guy loose, and the kids come back, and they're throwing stuff at him, and he ends up running away and riding his moped off again. And we go back to Kat, and everybody's kind of safe in the hospital, and they watch this visual on the TV screen of the president coming on to talk about what's happening and how they're going to fight this off and everything else. And the main chief commander of the army is kind of giving his little speech, and you can see him slowly starting to turn, and he grabs the president and he pulls out a grenade and shoves it in his mouth, and it just fucking explodes his head on air, and they turn it off. And at this point, Kat turns and she can see that the businessman is outside the doors, and the doors are made of glass, and he has an axe. So you can imagine what happens. He stabs through it with the axe, kills the guard that's there, and he has a bunch of people with him. So this is where a bunch more mayhem happens, and Kat ends up running off and running away to go hide, and there's people dying left and right. We do then see the businessman walk up to Molly, who is missing an eye, and this is where you might get one of those more disturbing scenes in the movie, because yes, he's gonna have sex with her eye socket, and we see him thrusting, but we don't see penetration or anything like that. So this is where like restraint on it is a good thing, because I don't think anybody wanted to see that, but it is still restraint, which is kind of that theme of where you know something's happening and they're kind of showing like the motion of what's happening, but they're not showing you. And the whole time this is happening, that security guard that they had punched in the face is laying underneath the cart, hiding, listening to it all, and looks like he wants to cry. So Kat escapes and she goes away. Jim's on his way to get to her. She stole the heavy guy's phone, and she was able to get a hold of Jim. So Jim tells him she's on his way. Just be safe. Turn off the ringer. Go hide. I will come find you. So he's got some hope to go find her. But he also has this weird hallucination when he's on the phone, where there's like a floating head in this water, and then he sees like a face, and it's like grabbing and like licking at the air, like it's just kind of that visual thing, and I don't know why he's seeing it, because there's no talk of anything like this prior in the movie. But as we move on, we go back to the heavyset guy who thinks that he's good to go and safe now, and he ends up looking around the corner, and we get to watch a big giant orgy of a bunch of naked people covered in blood having a good time. Why it's in the movie? Probably because we had to prove there is sexual stuff to this virus. Other than that, there's really no point in it. It's kind of one of those like throwaway things, but this is the one time where they didn't shy away. They show you what's going on. He then turns and he goes in the other direction to run off, and he sees Molly. And he's approaching Molly, and she's kind of eating a bunch of brains and shit, which is kind of a zombie-like thing, so good for her. And he kicks like a bedpan or something like that. So then she sees it's him. He kind of slows away. She comes after him with one of those lovely surgical saws, and all the people grab him because he made the sound, and they hold him down. And we see her going in like this, and this is another example of the not showing you, but showing you, so we're missing out on the gore. She's stabbing him, in what is presumed to be the stomach. As it's holding him, you see all the blood flying in his face, and you see some like chunks and shit kind of flying in his face here and there. But there's no graphicness of what the saw is actually doing to him. And this is another spot where they showed restraint, but this is where I wish they would have upped the ante. Maybe they didn't have the budget, since they did do a ton of shit in this movie, because there's blood and gore galore. But the gore is not as heavy as people make it out to be. That also depends on your threshold. It could be way more than what you could even handle. So he dies, and Kat's now trying to get away because somebody knew they like sniffed her out or something. And it's down to her, and she runs up these doors, runs through them as these two guys are chasing her, and she rips off part of the side of a medical bed, and she shoves it in the doors so they can't get through. The businessman gets up there, threatens her with some more sexual talk, and he squeezes through the little bit of space, and he tells the other guys that you don't get to have her, she's mine. And he squeezes the thing completely shut so they can't get in. As he's walking the halls, he's kind of looking for her and stuff like that. She hides out. She does end up getting the upper hand. She blows him with a fire extinguisher, hits him in the face a few times, and then he says, "Look at me, look at you, you're just like me, sick, vile, and depraved." And then she sits there and smashes his face in like crazy. The one doctor who's up there then opens the door and lets her in, but he refuses to trust her because obviously he's in all this hazmat suit and she's covered in all this virus blood. And he makes her shower down with this chemical bath, so he makes her strip naked, do that. She's not completely naked, but he does give her scrubs, but he makes her handcuff herself to the shower the whole time. And he explains the whole thing about the virus. Like I said earlier, this is where they give the exposition on how we know what the virus is doing. She goes to throw her clothes away in the one thing, and she hears crying, and there is a baby in there. Because this doctor's been trying to find a cure. And he made his way up there, and he's in the maternity ward, and he infected every single baby in there to see if they would be able to be immune, to try to create some sort of a vaccination. It turns out none of them were immune, so he killed all these babies for nothing. But we do get the latest infected baby version, like you do in most of these zombie-infected movies. They always got to have a baby in there, and we get it in this one. She ends up kind of being appalled, but like he says, what was he going to do? Look what this virus is doing. Look at what would have happened to these babies had somebody else got in here. I was trying to do the right thing and find a cure. What I'm doing isn't that bad, right? Because what could have happened to them would have been worse. I guess that's your moral dilemma in the movie. Well, he has the army coming to pick them up, and they both go outside of the room now to get ready to go upstairs because she's not infected. He even gave her a shot, and it looks like she's going to be okay. So she must be immune to this virus, so she might be able to be useful to help find a vaccination. As they're walking, one of those other two guys had slipped in, and they ended up chopping his foot, front of it, right off with an axe. He ends up shooting one, shooting the other, and they're done trying to get away, and Jim comes in. And now Jim is full-fledged infected. And the nice way you know this is because with the infected, they have pure black eyes. There's no white in their eyes. The whole thing is black. Their eyes are all red and puffy. And he's saying some sadistic shit about, oh, you're the new boyfriend. I can't wait to chop off your dick and shove it in your mouth. Hey, sorry, that's what they say in this movie. Very, very graphic talking. So, there's a little bit of a fight that ensues, and she ends up getting the doctor's keys. Jim gets stabbed, the guy gets stabbed. She ends up unlocking the door to go upstairs, and she locks it so Jim can't get through. They have like a little moment where he's like expressing how much he loved her and he got there for her, which is his cognitive side of things. But then he talks about how he's been waiting this whole time so that he could skin her. And he's smiling about it. And she's crying. And this is where the movie is going to end, but it's going to be kind of an ambiguous ending. She goes out on the helicopter pad. She doesn't have her arms up or anything. She just walks up there. The door's shut. We zoom in on Jim's face, and you hear gunshots. Presuming that she died. They shot her because she wasn't the doctor, and she didn't put her hands up, maybe. Maybe she was turning infected. Maybe she wasn't, and they killed the only person who could save humanity. We don't know, but the movie ends. All right, so overall thoughts. Is this a disturbing movie? Maybe, depending on who you are. I'm going with no. I don't think this movie is disturbing. It does have like a lot of like sexual violent themes in it, so raping and stuff like that. If you find that stuff very disturbing, then it will affect you. If you find buckets and buckets and buckets of blood to be kind of a gross thing, that will bother you. Gore wise, they do hold back quite a bit for being a movie that's extremely gory. It could have been a lot worse. But you do get your money's worth. The one thing I will say is for this type of movie, I went in kind of blind the first time I watched it, and I rewatched it before shooting this video because this is one that's actually a lot of fun. If you're looking for a good time, this is a fun movie. It's very violent, it's very graphic, it's very depraved. But if you like a high pace, fast action horror that's just balls to the wall, but no real comedy. So it's not a horror comedy. But it is pretty action packed. Like, I think you go 7 minutes before you see shit happen, and it just runs kind of the whole time. And the first half is a little more action packed than the second half because they try to throw a little story in there. And if you're looking for story, this is not your movie. This is plain Jane, basic stories you can possibly get. But there is a lot of blood. There is a lot of killing. There is a lot of sexual talk and a lot of people doing stuff that you wouldn't expect. And I guess that's kind of where it gets its thing from, is because you're seeing people do things that they wouldn't normally show you in a movie unless you're going for one of these popcorn torture porn type movies. Kind of like how Saw got to be, where it was like you kind of went just to see the traps. This one you're going in there and you're like, I'm here to see the gore. And they don't disappoint. It's not as disturbing as everybody makes it out to be. But overall, it's a fun movie. The story is what it needs to be for this type of movie. The acting, for the most part, is actually really good. I wouldn't know any of these people. This is a foreign film. It is made in Taiwan. The director, this is the first movie he ever directed. He wrote it, directed it, and edited it. And they did it literally because the pandemic in the real world had happened, and they saw people were watching pandemic-type movies on Netflix. And the guy who was funding him to write a different movie, said, stop, we need to do this because this is working right now. We don't think people want to get away from the pandemic, people want to watch it. And that's what they did. And it was a fun movie. I would give it like a 4.25 out of 5. It's a good time. But until the next one, guys, rest in peace.